What is fascism?
Fascism is a political ideology that emphasizes extreme nationalism, militarism, and a focus on the leader's cult of personality. Fascists believe in the superiority of their nation and seek to create a centralized, authoritarian state that controls all aspects of society. They reject liberal democracy and instead advocate for a one-party dictatorship. Fascism also often includes elements of social conservatism, anti-communism, and anti-Semitism. Historical examples of fascist regimes include Nazi Germany under Hitler and Mussolini's Italy.
Is fascism totalitarian or authoritarian?
Fascism is often described as a totalitarian ideology. Totalitarianism refers to a form of government or political system in which the state has total control over all aspects of the lives of individuals and suppresses political opposition. Fascism often has the hallmarks of totalitarian regimes, such as authoritarian leaders, the suppression of individual freedoms and minorities, control of the media, and the suppression of one's opponents. Fascism can also be centralized in nature, where the state controls all aspects of economics, politics, culture, and society.
Was Soviet totalitarian or authoritarian?
It may be controversial to describe the Soviet Union as totalitarian, but it is widely accepted that it was an authoritarian regime. The Soviet Union was a communist country led by a single party, the Communist Party, and had a centralized and authoritarian system in which the state had great control over the economy, politics, culture, and society. It was a suppression of individual freedoms, control of the media, repression of political opponents, and mass deportation of the population that did not fit into the regime's ideology and politics. There was also a vast network of surveillance, police and security forces used to suppress dissent. So while there may be debate about how totalitarian the Soviet Union was, there is no denying that it was an authoritarian regime that had great control over the population and suppressed freedoms and rights.
What about China, then and now?
China has had an authoritarian regime since the Communist Party came to power in 1949. The regime has had great control over the economy, politics, culture, and society. The regime has also suppressed individual liberties, controlled the media, suppressed political opposition, and used police and security forces to suppress dissent. However, there is an important difference between China then and now. China has undergone an economic reform process that has led to economic growth and development. This has led to an increase in prosperity for many Chinese, and to some extent increased freedom and increased opportunities for individuals and businesses. Nevertheless, the control of the Communist Party and the state over the economy and society continues to be very large, and there is a continuous suppression of individual freedoms and freedom of expression, and oppression of political opposition and minorities. So even though China has made economic progress in the past, it continues to be an authoritarian regime that suppresses freedoms and rights.
Where do you draw the line between authoritarian and totalitarian?
The boundary between authoritarian and totalitarian can be subjective and can vary from person to person. But generally speaking, authoritarian regimes tend to be less totalitarian than totalitarian regimes. An authoritarian regime often has certain elements of totalitarianism, such as the suppression of political opposition and the suppression of individual freedoms, but it can also have some elements of democracy, such as choice, and may allow some degree of financial freedom and personal freedom. Totalitarian regimes, on the other hand, tend to have complete control over the economy, politics, culture, and society, completely suppressing individual liberties and political opposition. They also tend to have a single party that has complete control over the government and suppresses all forms of political dissent. So the boundary between authoritarian and totalitarian can vary from regime to regime, and can also vary in the degree of control and suppression of individual freedoms and political opposition.
Is totalitarianism used only for right-side regimes and not left-side regimes?
Totalitarianism is not limited to right or left-wing regimes. It can be present in both right and left-wing regimes. Both can have totalitarian traits, such as the suppression of individual freedoms and political opposition, and control over the economy, politics, culture, and society. However, it is important to point out that totalitarianism can manifest itself in different ways in different regimes, depending on ideology and historical context. For example, fascist regimes such as the Italian under Mussolini and the German under Hitler were known to be highly authoritarian and oppressive, while communist regimes such as the Soviet Union and China has been known to be highly totalitarian and oppressive.
Based on this context, it is important to point out that totalitarianism can manifest itself in different ways in different regimes, depending on ideology and historical context. For example, fascist regimes such as the Italian under Mussolini and the German under Hitler were known to be highly authoritarian and oppressive, while communist regimes such as the Soviet Union and China has been known to be highly totalitarian and oppressive. Why is not Lenin, Stalin, and Mao included when descriptions of totalitarianism are used?
It is possible that the context you provided did not specifically mention Lenin, Stalin, and Mao because it was focusing on examples of fascist regimes and communist regimes in general, rather than specific leaders within those regimes. Additionally, the examples of Mussolini and Hitler are often used as quintessential examples of fascist leaders, while Soviet Union and China are often used as examples of communist regimes. It's also worth noting that the historical context, ideology, and the nature of repression in Soviet Union under Lenin, Stalin and China under Mao were different in comparison to the fascist regimes of Italy and Germany under Mussolini and Hitler respectively.
Communist regimes, despite of murders, imprisonment, and suppression of people, killing of academics, suppression of political opponents, suppression of free speech, not considered as fascism.
Communist regimes have been known for their strict control over society, including the use of violence, repression, and suppression of political opponents and free speech. These actions are typically associated with totalitarianism rather than fascism, which is a specific political ideology characterized by extreme nationalism, authoritarianism, and the suppression of political opposition. While there are some similarities between the two, they are distinct ideologies with different historical origins and beliefs.
What regimes are considered totalitarian?
Here is a list of ideologies that have been associated with totalitarianism.
Fascism. Communism. Nationalism, when it takes an extreme, totalitarian form. Give examples, in your view, of regimes classified accordingly.
Here is a list of historical regimes that are associated with the three ideologies I mentioned in my previous answer that have been associated with totalitarianism in the past. Fascism. Nazi Germany under the rule of Adolf Hitler. Fascist Italy under the rule of Benito Mussolini. Francoist Spain under the rule of General Francisco Franco. Communism. Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin. China under Mao Zedong. Cambodia under the Khmer Rouge regime. Nationalism, when it takes an extreme, totalitarian form. Nazi Germany under the rule of Adolf Hitler.
To summarize, there are currently no widely recognized, textbook examples of totalitarian regimes in the world today. However, there are many governments that have been accused of exhibiting some of the characteristics of totalitarianism, such as North Korea, which is known for its strict control over its citizens, censorship of the media, and cult of personality around its leaders. Here is a non-exhaustive list of countries that are often referred to as authoritarian regimes today. North Korea, Iran, China, Venezuela, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Myanmar, Burma, Sudan, Syria. It's important to note that the classification of a country as an authoritarian regime can be subjective and depend on various criteria, such as the level of political repression, restrictions on civil liberties, and the extent of government control over the media and other institutions. Some of these countries have been accused of widespread human rights abuses and violating international law.
An example.
The war on drugs launched by Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has been widely criticized for its heavy-handed approach and the high number of extrajudicial killings that have taken place. Human rights organizations and international bodies have accused the Philippine government of widespread human rights abuses and violations of due process in its anti-drug campaign. In terms of classifying it in the context of political systems, some might argue that the war on drugs has contributed to an increase in authoritarianism in the Philippines, as it has been characterized by a disregard for due process and the rule of law. However, the Philippines still has a functioning parliamentary democracy and regular elections, so it may not be accurate to classify it as a fully authoritarian regime. It's worth noting that the classification of a country's political system can be complex and dependent on various factors. In the case of the Philippines, while the war on drugs has raised serious concerns about the government's respect for human rights and the rule of law, it is just one aspect of the country's political system and should be considered in the broader context of Philippine politics.